Hey folks, it's Ardwulf. Welcome to Ardwulf's Lair. We have a interview today with a very special guest, Taylor Shuss. He is the designer of Stonewall Uprising, which is now on Kickstarter when you are seeing this, from Catastrophe Games, friends of the channel. So please do check that out. There will be a link to the video description, to the Kickstarter in the video description. It's going to run for a pretty standard amount of time. You can see all the details, and I think we said that the products will ship sometime before the end of the year. So Taylor, welcome back to the show. We've had some technical difficulties tonight, so we appreciate your patience. So tell us a little bit about your background as a gamer, in preparation for talking a little bit more about Stonewall Uprising itself.
Sure. Yeah, I as a gamer, I'd say my intro was maybe not bog standard, but not far off. I started off, I think the first the first couple hobby games I played were like your Dominion, your Catan, your like Smash Up, stuff like that. Um and I started playing more and more games, and I got deeper and deeper into it. Um and after I played a game called Risk Legacy, I realized, hey, maybe I could make, maybe I could make one of these. Maybe I could try making some games and see what happens. And I guess my first game's releasing soon, so I guess you know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, this will be, I mean, we've all, I think those of us who've been doing this for a while have all probably had our run-ins with game design, but you've actually finished one. So is the design like finalized then, and it's just a matter of sewing the final physical components up? Is that where we are?
Yeah, that it's been that way. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So in the context of that background as a gamer, what is it about Stonewall, the Stonewall Uprising specifically? Although we'll also talk about the entire context of the game, that made you want to design a game that simulates this subject matter.
So what happened was, in 2018 I was working on a game that like shifted, the board shifted as you played, and I was chatting with a friend at a convention while playtesting it about how I wasn't happy with the theme. I wanted to retheme the game, and we were discussing that. We were talking about maybe your life as you age is a very abstract way of doing it, or like the Mongols going across Europe, things like that. And he recommended Moses having the Jews leave Egypt. They're making this great crossing, and that idea was pretty interesting. But I realized pretty immediately, I don't know. I'm not a biblical scholar. I barely read the Bible, and I'm also not Jewish at all. So like, it'd be comically inauthentic for me to tell that story. And after I thought about that, I immediately wondered, well, what story might I be able to tell that might be actually authentic? A story that maybe other designers can't just tell. And so I thought about that, and I quickly came to the idea, one of the most important moments in modern queer history is the Stonewall riots, or as they're known now, Stonewall Uprising. And I began thinking about how one might make a game based on that. It took a while to get there, but I began in 2018.
So, of course, the media framing at the time was like is so often the case with these kinds of things. The Tulsa riots with exactly the same, not exactly the same, but an analogous situation where it was not a riot but a pogrom. So, tell us a little bit about the Stonewall Uprising itself that the game is named after, and then we'll kind of take a step back and talk about the game scope, which is broader than just the 3 days of the uprising itself.
Yeah. So in the late 50s, early 60s, there were a lot of gay groups that were forming and trying to make headways, but they were pretty ineffectual. I mean, they were good at talking to each other and whatnot, but they weren't really making headlines. They weren't really generating a lot of support. And then in June of 1969 in New York, in Greenwich Village, there was a bar, a terrible bar run by the mob that was infamously known for blackmailing their patrons as their real source of income. And they were raided by the police. Now, this wasn't uncommon, although the mob was apparently unaware they were doing this, that was unusual. But what was even more unusual was that the patrons of the Stonewall Inn fought back, and they fought back successfully. In fact, they fought back so successfully, they did it for 3 nights. from the 28th, 29th, and the 30th, which is, by the way, why we're launching the game on the 28th of June, right there. And so, the Stonewall Inn might be, my understanding here, the worst gay bar in New York at the time. It was the patrons were all they were all queer youth generally, but they were also people of color and from other minorities who are used to dealing with the police in certain ways, which maybe the more upper class gay cis men weren't. And so they fought back, and um, that spread quick, and people realized, hey, we can fight back against these people, and we can actually win. We can make a real dent in what's going on. And it kind of was the spark that ignited a lot of the fire and what you see going forward.
Okay, and then of course I think the game, as we talked about, the game itself kind of simulates a multi-decade period of the gay civil rights movement. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is the taking two steps back? What is the scope of the game?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, the scope of the game is the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And it's Pride versus the Man fighting for against their rights. And it is a game where you are, it's very abstracted. It's not like a hex encounter deal. But you are fighting over 3 games of tug of war, essentially. And as you make headway, decades begin to pass, and you see new faces, and get new abilities in game terms. And it's definitely a game where you're probably going to learn a few things you did not know, because there's so much that happens. I couldn't even fit it all in the game, if I'm being honest. There's so much research that I did or tried to do. I'm not a historian, but I definitely read a lot and learned a lot more than I was expecting in some ways. So yeah, I mean, that 30-year period, it ends at 89 loosely. You kind of get a peek into the 90s, depending on how the game goes, and it can end earlier. But yeah, I mean, far back, it's a 30-year time span, and you are, trying to keep, if you're Pride, you're trying to keep the spark alive and keep it moving, and if you're the Man, you're trying to stamp it out.
Okay, so 2 players, and what's the estimated playtime? And did you find that was a parameter that you had to carefully manage so that it didn't get too long or too short?
So yeah, so it's a 2-player game. The box says 60 to 90. Once you've played a game, I think you can play it under 60 pretty reasonably well. As for playtime, I never had a big issue with playtime being a big concern. Um, I would say I would say that it kind of naturally segued. People wanted more content. When I first worked on the game, it was just the 60s, right? And the more I worked on it, the more people wanted like more meat to the game, so to speak. And so it was pretty often, once I added the 70s and 80s to the game, once that really felt fleshed out and remotely balanced, let's say, um, I I would argue that playtime just felt about right naturally. I mean, of course, there was this or that. I mean, we shortened this and made these cards, so they did that. But I'd say overall, we never had any big issues with playtime. I like my games typically on the shorter end. If a game's over 2 hours, I tend to get finicky. I know some games I do like some games that go over, and it's cool if anyone else does. But I like them on the shorter side typically.
Did you see the thing we were playing at Origins?
I did. That looked intense.
For 24 hours.
Yeah.
It was more than that, actually. It was more like 30 hours, but
and I mean, I've played games that probably last 8 or 10 hours, maybe 12.
Mhm.
I've played a couple of those games, but 1, they are the extreme outlier for me, and 2, I would never want to make one because I'd have to actually play it a bunch. And that's just I just can't imagine getting that in the weeds and getting players for that isn't just one group. And you want a diverse group of voices when you're doing something like this to tell you when you're steering the ship wrong, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you don't want a cadre of yes people that will just tell you, "Oh, it's great, it's great."
Yeah.
Your mom is probably the wrong choice, for example.
Yeah, that's I think a typical failing point for a lot of newer designers who they don't want to hear the no's deep down. They really don't want to hear it, and they might know that they need to hear it to become a better designer. but boy, is it hard to hear at first. And so I can understand that, but you desperately need to. It's the only way your game's going to get better.
So let me ask a question that we didn't already talk about. So I apologize if this is going to catch you a little bit flat-footed, but we're talking about a topic that, like a game like This Guilty Land or a game like Votes for Women, that is a serious social topic. And these are challenging topics to address, because unless it's a solitaire or a cooperative game, somebody's going to have to be the bad guy, right? Not even air quotes. There's a bad guy, right?
Yeah.
Or in a game like Amabel's game about slavery. I mean, it's very difficult topics. What is it about? What challenges do you feel that you faced because of the difficulty of the topic or the sensitivity of the topic, and that other designers operating in similar spaces might also encounter?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, it's a hazardous path to take. I think I think that navigating any challenging history is going to be hard, even if it is like a fully cooperative endeavor. To be frank, right? That on its own is just hard,
Mhm.
because it's already hard history. It's
Mhm.
it's never just going to be a fun. Oh, I just gotta walk through the park, and no,
Oh yeah,
not how it.
so
Yeah,
freedom from
yeah,
Academy
freedom.
Games,
Exactly.
Underground Railroad cooperative game. It is not a happy and pleasant game.
Exactly. Yeah, and I'm sure they got a lot of flack for that as well. So I
Mhm.
just, to be clear, just because someone plays a bad guy, I don't think you just kind of get, oh, well, that, even cooperative, even solo games, it's still rough. However, in a game where you actively play as, the bad guy, as a negative force, and like the game labels it as a negative force, which I would say mine does. Um, there is, the value from in a game like mine, and I think in a lot of games that I've seen where you play as those kinds of forces, is showing why they were so negative and giving you sympathy for the other side. One thing I talk about a lot in Stonewall is how pride's cards are, I mean, we got two artists, so one side looks vibrant and uplifting and positive, and one side looks grimy and dirty and I mean, evil might be the word. Um, but the idea is that you're seeing what you're doing as the man, and you are not supposed to agree with it as a player. You're supposed to see these things about how you're detaining and then demoralizing people, and realize, maybe, just maybe, this isn't a positive thing I'm doing. Maybe, maybe I'm the bad guy here, and I'm being the asshole in this situation. So that was a big thing that I wanted to work on. It's one of the reasons why Pride has all these named people. It has Marsha P. Johnson and Harvey Milk and Gilbert Baker and Jose Saria. And then you have the man, and they don't have named people. They don't get anybody named. I don't give them any idols to look up to. Instead, they have like tools of oppression, right? They have systems and cogs that work together, but they don't have real people, because those people don't stick around. They lose a couple fights and bail out. But the people in the Pride movement, that's their livelihood. They can't just leave. This is them.
I guess that's the Soul Man lesson, I suppose. That was the moral of the otherwise not very great movie with C. Thomas Howell from the 80s, I would imagine. But bad movie history is not why we've tuned in here tonight. So let's then talk about the mechanics. So I think we've established that the Stonewall Uprising game is not a tactical hex-based simulation of the cops fighting the inhabitants of the Stonewall Inn on
It
a
is
hex
not.
grid, which would be probably ultimately unengaging and somewhat tasteless. So let's talk about the mechanics that you've leveraged here. It's a card. It is a deck building game, and I'll let you elaborate, because I am not your guy when it comes to talking about this.
Yeah, so it's a deck. Stonewall Uprising is a deck building game, and it also has three tracks, three things you're playing tug of war over: systemic support, public support, and individual support. And so your cards move you along those three abstract positions, trying to gain support and make it harder for your opponent to do well. The deck building is, in my opinion, a big part of what makes this, maybe not a big part, but part of what makes this historical, because you will see the same themes pop up over and over. You're going to see the same people popping up over and over. People don't just randomly leave these movements. People don't just randomly join these movements. Um, And so, on the Pride side, you might get Marsha P. Johnson in the 60s, and then she keeps fighting throughout the 70s and the 80s. You're going to see these people pop up and keep fighting and hammering at what they know and, for their livelihood. And likewise for the man, you're going to use systems of oppression and you're just going to drop them. Those are useful tools for you. So you're going to keep using them to oppress people. And mechanically, I like that shows that because, you shuffle a deck and it's random, so you never know exactly what you're going to get, but those are the tools you've chosen to use. And each decade, you're going to see new tools and new people and new ideas you can try. That's where a lot of the replayability comes in, is that you just can't buy every card. When you go to the 70s, all the 60s cards go away. They're gone from the game. You lost your chance to use them. And so those are kind of the core mechanics, which I probably sound really simplistic. But my goal wasn't to make some hyper detailed, complex game with all these little rules about making pasta or something. So, there's that.
Okay, so you actually answered my one of my questions there about whether there was a pasta rule or not, and B, whether it's like a phased deck builder, like say Triad Struggle is not really a deck builder, but the deck is phased where there's an early, middle, and a late period. It sounds like that's the case here as well.
Yeah, that's just for your markets, right? The cards you have access to buying are just structured in that you see the next decade as it comes up. So you're not going to buy 80s cards in the 70s. You might get a sneak peek, but you can't buy them yet.
Okay, so let's kind of move in the direction of wrapping up a little bit. Let me remind everybody that Kickstarter is live right now. There's a link in the video description so that you can check it out. Game is planned to be delivered. I don't want to hold anybody's feet to the fire on an exact date, so let's say in a few months' time. But they'll be printed through Blue Panther, so chances of massive delays seem unlikely. And Catastrophe Games has not yet had a major boo-boo on Kickstarter delivery either.
Fingers crossed there.
Yeah. So what advice would you give somebody who's approaching some of these sort of a challenging game like Stonewall Uprising on a challenging, serious social subject? I think from the standpoint of whether that person is queer or not, right? I mean, you have to, I would think you want people to engage with this history, and ideally you would want queer and non-queer people to try to engage with that history, to try and understand it better, particularly since this is history that we don't really learn about here. We certainly, Stonewall was never mentioned when I was in high school, and I went to high school 20 years after the event. Not even in the context of riots. So this is history that the educational system and the media and the man, if you will, kind of doesn't really want us to know about, or at least is not interested in helping us to understand. So somebody that comes across the game, they wander past the booth at Origins and say, "Oh, what's that all about?" What is your elevator pitch to try and get that person who hasn't previously engaged with this subject matter interested in this game?
Yeah, I would say that the big sticking point, the big reason to be interested and to want to stick around looking at a game like this to someone who maybe is unsure is probably along the lines of a game like this is supposed to help contextualize what's happening now by showing what happened in the past. Those 30 years are not an accident. Those 30 years of fighting and struggle and heartbreak are not random. They don't happen accidentally. And so it's supposed to show you, hey, what's happening now, this is why it's happening. This should contextualize what's happening right now and why this is relevant by showing you the past and showing what happened. History is cyclical in so many ways. And while working on the game, I constantly saw stuff that I saw echoes of today. The big one is probably the term like "think of the children." I saw that over and over and over and over every single decade, and then I go on Twitter and I see the same thing. And it's really about how relevant the topic is. How this is all in living memory. This isn't 300, 400 years ago. This is all people who are alive. You might have lived through this, and it's not just some random series of events. It's all important and all of it, what we have today is because of what happened then. And that's still the truth. And that'll, yeah. So I would say those are the big reasons. That's why someone should really look at the game seriously and think about it earnestly.
And engage with it. And these kinds of games, I think we can agree, are just a vehicle for getting people to engage with that history. And I think we can also agree that this is still relevant today. That this is a contest that has not yet ended. And therefore the subject remains super relevant today. So without ending us on too heavy of a note, thanks so much, Taylor, for coming by tonight, and especially for sticking around through the many technical challenges and vicissitudes that we have suffered through this evening. And we're going to end right on time, even though we ended a half an hour early. So we'll talk about the problems on the Monday night stream, I am sure. So thanks very much, Taylor. Again, check out the Kickstarter, which is linked in the video description, and you can get more information there. And hopefully in a few months, we will see Stonewall Uprising on our game shelves.
Thanks for having me.
Everybody have a great night.